Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Now let's start with our panel. Sir David, we're going to ask you to start and maybe talk about the important role of innovation and research in solving this problem and maybe some of the initiatives that you see on the landscape that can be helpful to us.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to argue that the momentous decision reached on 12/12/15 in Paris is the biggest opportunity of our era. And this is an opportunity created out of managing a problem. And the reason I'm describing it as an opportunity is because I think all economies of the world will benefit in this process of transitioning to zero carbon energy systems. Now, already largely driven through feed-in tariffs in Europe and in California and a few other areas in the world, fossil fuel is now becoming competitive, or we're seeing it's being competed with against renewable energy installations, new renewable energy primary installations. And this is, of course, changing the whole situation. We have seen that in 2014, we saw more than 50% of primary energy installation in the whole world was from renewable energy. This is very largely driven by price competitiveness. And as we go to 2015, the IEA is now giving an initial estimate of 90%. So a big part of the job has already been happening before Paris, but now when we look at what happened in Paris, we see that there's a second opportunity for a driver for change. The nationally determined contributions, and while they don't add up, if we do an arithmetic add up to a 2-degree world, in fact it's more like a 3 to 4 degree world, they do mean that there's a big surge in primary energy demand for renewables, because all of these countries, as they implement their nationally determined contributions, are creating a new market for these. So the volume of the market over the past 15 years has been the driver for this learning curve, the price competitiveness of renewable energy. Now, one major factor has been, well, let me just quickly add, there's another driver, which was the agreement reached in the side of the Paris meeting between Britain and the United States on Energy Africa and Power Africa. That's an agreement that, using our aid budgets and using the development process to reach 620 million people in Africa who currently have no access to electricity. One of the big advantages of renewable energy is that it's distributed, and it's going to be 2 or 3 times cheaper to roll electricity out to these off-grid villages than it would be to extend the grids. So this is a doable project, and we're going to work with African governments to roll this out. But the point again I want to emphasize is, here goes the market, getting bigger and bigger. And as the market gets bigger, the prices will keep falling, and that's a self-accelerating process. So I think that what we'll end up with is far better than the NDCs, simply because of price competitiveness. Now, there is a gap, and it's a very serious series of gaps. Feed-in tariffs have done absolutely nothing for energy storage technologies. They've done nothing for smart grids, nothing for smart meters. They've done nothing for mobility, surface and air mobility in a zero carbon world. And what mission innovation is aimed at is a big surge in public funding, collaborative public funding. 20 countries have joined hands on this in the research and development arena to de-risk new technologies for the private sector to take into the marketplace. So on the first hand, we've got mission innovation, which amounts to more than $20 billion a year being funded in the research arena around the world. And this will be a collaborative effort by these 20 countries. And by the way, the 20 countries represent more than 80% of RD&D funding around the world. So these are the research-rich countries, but it's also important to say we've got China and India on board as well. What we then see is the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which is Bill Gates and a group of 28 wealthy people coming up with around $20 billion in venture capital funding, sitting, waiting for the new technologies to come through. Now, if I was a young research scientist, again, I'd be very excited about this. I can go in, get the money from mission innovation, knowing that if I find a new technology, there's mission innovation, through mission innovation, I'm going to have Breakthrough Energy Coalition barking at my door and saying, could I have that technology? And we'll develop small companies. And of course, the large companies will also benefit from this process. And what I want to say is that I would like to see the oil companies coming on board, the IOCs coming on board, so that they are assisted in the essential transition they have to make from being a fossil fuel-based sector into a fossil fuel-free sector. So the bottom line is that I believe we are spelling the end of the fossil fuel era. The decisions in Paris say this has to happen this side of 2050. So we have, time is not on our side. We need to push all of these things very quickly. But what it means is that we will have a cleaner planet. We will have clean air. Clean energy is not only low in carbon dioxide, it's also zero in C2.5 particulate matter and all the other mishaps that occur with fossil fuel usage. What we will do is deal with climate change and create a better planet, and at the same time improve human well-being and wealth for all countries. So there's my positive view of the outcome of Paris.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Dr. Zhang, you've been at the center of a lot of the discussions of technical analysis, policy making, and R&D in China, which of course is the world's second largest economy and largest emitter, and on the cusp of transformational changes in response to the climate issue. Can you tell us what insights you have to bring to this from your perspective, and how we need to get collaboration across the world to really solve this problem?
Thank you very much. So, and Dr. King mentioned the low carbon energy economy transformation and highlights the importance of the technological innovation. So I'm a professor of energy management and climate policy at Tsinghua University. So I would like to highlight the importance of the climate policy. So because only you have a climate policy, so they can enabling the transformation. And at the same time, so we have to recognize that the process of climate policy making so involves different kinds of trade-offs, so which the political leaders have to address. So it leads needs for the scientific community to structure the information on the costs and the benefits and their distributions across regions and between generations. So before a big climate policy or big climate pledge so is made. And in the context of China, so I know the policymakers have been increasing importance to the analysis work. So in the climate policy making. So in China, I think several institutions, so academic institutions like Tsinghua University, involved the whole process of key policy, key climate policy making, such as the INDC, and also currently, so I'm leading a research team in China, which conducts study. The study aims at assisting the National Development and Reform Commission in designing China's national carbon emission cap trade scheme system. So and also other institutions involved in this area. So usually, so particularly in the developing nations, the government the agency have not a capacity to conduct a very very deep analysis. So that's why they need the scientific community and institutional organizations to involve to accomplish the analytical work. So and also another observation is that so even the academic institutions in the developing nations often lack of the capacity and for the analysis work, particularly the lack of they are not sufficient scientific analytical tools to conduct risk analysis. So in this context, I think the cooperations between the academic institutions, so in the developing and the developing nations could play a very important role. So my experience, so we have a Tsinghua University, so we are a leading university in China, but I feel we still lack of the capacity tools for conduct analysis work 5 years ago, at least 5 years ago. So we built several collaboration initiatives with different institutions in the developing nations. For example, so we have we have a very close ties with, I think Jay Edmund is here, so his PNNL, the team, and also, so 5 years ago, so we launched a 5-year research collaboration with MIT. So I named the China Energy and Climate Project. So over the past, we try recognizing the needs of the strong analysis work, and also because we also would like to fill in the gaps. So even the gaps. So I think after over the 5 years, so the project result several major achievements. So including two energy economic model has been developed under the program. So right now, these two energy economic model become very powerful tools for conduct the climate policy analysis. So and I think it's also amazing that the analytical work also was an important input to the development of China's national INDC, and also provide technical support for the U.S.-China dialogue on the joint climate change announcement. So and also I think right now it also provides technical support for the design of the national carbon capture trade emission system. So I think it's very amazing. I think for other developing nations, so they also need certain kind of analytical work and also the collaboration with the institutions in the developing nations. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kress, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we need not only technologies and market mechanisms, we also need an engaged public and people changing their behaviors and consumption patterns. Can you tell us what you've learned through your work at the Smithsonian around this very important aspect of the problem?
Certainly, Alden, thank you. And I'm very pleased to be here representing a different community that has not been heard from yet in these last 2 days, and that's the public and private museum community that has a lot to do with reaching out to the public. Some of you may or may not know that the Smithsonian has 19 different museums, the National Zoo, each of those dedicated to reaching out to the public. We also have 9 research institutes scattered around the world that are not only involved in reaching out to the public in their own ways, but also increasing the amount of knowledge and increasing the specific knowledge that we relate to the public. Besides that, museums, not only the Smithsonian, and we happen to have a lot of objects and specimens at the Smithsonian, but all museums around the world have some level of collections, and that's extremely important in terms of one aspect of museums that I think can address this subject in a very meaningful way, and that's change. The Smithsonian started in 1846 after the U.S. exploring expedition returned from going around the world for 4 years, bringing back all these objects, whether they're dried plant specimens or archaeological artifacts, and suddenly there was no place to put them. The Smithsonian became the repository of those, and from those original 100,000 collections, we now have 138 million objects. Those objects tell us about change. They tell us about change since that expedition came back, but they also tell us about change since the planet began 4.6 million years ago. And I think that's one of the most important things that museums can actually bring to the public, this sense of change, and not just change in the environments, but changes in our culture. We not only have these biological specimens, but we have cultural artifacts that represent all the cultures of the planet. They tell us what happened on the physical and biological parts of the planet, but for example, the Smithsonian, they also tell us how the United States has changed since the Civil War, something as basic as that. Now, I want to introduce a term, take a couple minutes to do that, called the Anthropocene. I mentioned this last night, and we haven't heard that term very much at this conference. The Anthropocene is the scientific egghead term for the age of humans, and it simply represents a new phase of the planet which is now being affected by humans in a major way. And we've been concentrating on climate change, but there are many other factors that humans are responsible for that have caused the planet to change and receive this new designation as the Anthropocene. Whether it's habitat degradation, we've heard a little bit about that, whether it's biodiversity extinction, whether it's the transport of species all around the world now, including invasive species, which are having a big impact. Pollution, particularly plastic. We haven't heard that much about that except for CO2 pollution. And also, I think a big factor that the Smithsonian's involved in is the homogenization of cultures. That is not only affecting our own civilizations, but also affecting the planet. Now, when you define the Anthropocene, we define it in all those different ways. Some define the Anthropocene as starting with the Industrial Revolution when CO2 had its big effect. But others define the Anthropocene starting 100,000 years ago when humans first caused the megafauna to begin to go extinct. Others define the Anthropocene when agriculture began about 10,000 years ago, when habitat degradation began in a big way. Others define the Anthropocene with the Industrial Revolution and CO2, and some even define the Anthropocene with the invention of major modern warfare and the first atomic explosion in 1945. So all of these factors are about change and about change that humans have affected, and the Smithsonian is very interested in getting that idea of change out to the public. We're so interested that our scientists and scholars, not just scientists, but our historians, our art curators, have gotten together to form what we call the Living in the Anthropocene Initiative. And what this is about is telling the public, don't worry about change. Change happens. It's always happened. But there's a change going on now that has a certain urgency that we all need to pay attention to it. And that's exactly what the Smithsonian is trying to do. And I think other museums are beginning to join in the same effort as the Smithsonian.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Hultman, we not only have to innovate technologies and figure out how to deploy them, but we have to increase the ability and capacity of governments to develop their targets, to track and monitor progress towards their targets, and most importantly, to think how they wrap their heads around this need to decarbonize the global economy at a pace unforeseen in human history. What can you tell us about those challenges and how we increase the ability of governments to deal with these challenges?
Thanks, Alden. That's a key question, and as we've heard from the panelists today, we've heard a lot about both the what we have to do on the time scale that we have to do it, and also a little bit about how we might go about implementing that, how we might go about realizing that vision, not only in the longer term, but also in the short term, and that's what I'd like to speak to today. I've just come back to the research community after a couple of years working with a great team at the White House and the broader U.S. government on our U.S. national target and thinking about other countries' INDCs as well, leading up to Paris. And it was, of course, a really interesting experience. I think all of the people who were involved in that process globally, many of whom are here, are excited about this new architecture, the nationally determined contributions, but we also recognize the deep challenges that we have, not only to implement the ones we've put on the table, many of which are quite ambitious, but also to think about how we might, over time, ramp up the ambition, as was noted by Dr. Lee and Sir David, to get to a well below 2-degree world by the end of the century. So I'd like to comment on 3 tasks as it relates to that process and 3 dimensions of those tasks very briefly. The 3 tasks Alden very briefly kind of sketched out, but the first one, of course, and we've heard a little bit about this over the course of the 2 days here, is to think about how countries are doing over time against their targets. So we clearly need to know, as part of the kind of core element of Paris, is this idea that we have to be visibly tracking how countries are doing toward their pledges. That requires both engagement by governments as they're reporting their progress out to the community. We're working on that process of what that actually looks like over the coming, hopefully, months and not years, but soon we'll have a sense of that. And similarly by civil society, a more broad community that's also tracking progress that countries are making, how well are they doing toward the promises that they made in Paris. And so setting up that process is a key element, and I'll return to how we might do that. The second dimension is, of course, getting ready for the next round of target setting. We are probably about 30 months from the period where countries are going to have to start thinking about their next target. And we all recognize and we all, I think, understand that these targets are sort of the first targets or stepping stones toward a more ambitious target setting process over time. And to think about how we can get ready at the national level, the governments at the national level, but also as a wider community, to put down targets in 30, or well, not 30, to start thinking about the targets in 30 months that then will be put down subsequently to get us on that path toward a more ambitious trajectory downward to get us to that well below 2-degree world. And then the third task is to think about the mid-century strategy. This relates to actually many of the comments that have been made today. We know we have to get to very deep decarbonization by the end of the century and frankly even by mid-century. And the Paris Agreement provides an opportunity for countries to think about what their plan looks like. That's a broader opportunity for the community, right? We can think about, governments are going to be thinking about what they need to do now to put them on the right path to get to that deep decarbonization. So that's a third dimension where we in the kind of community of researchers, but also broader civil society, can be helping our national governments to think through the implications of those for present-day decision-making. So I said those are the three tasks, and then there's three dimensions. The first dimension is frankly one that Dr. Lee already sort of laid out for us. It's how the scientific community and the research community understands these problems. So bringing our tools of research and understanding into the process to better inform, first of all, how fast we need to go, but then to Sir David's point, what kinds of technologies are available, what is the potential for different kinds of technology. The second dimension is working with governments and to think about how to inform them. This is actually Dr. Zhang's comment, thinking about national governments, of course, rely on their domestic institutions, their research institutions, for good information. The IPCC is obviously a very important part of this, but there's also reliance on national institutions as well. And so building up the capacity of those national institutions much more deeply and much more broadly is a second element that Dr. Zhang mentioned, but those then have to be linked into the national processes as countries are thinking about both complying with their targets and also developing their new ones. And then the third dimension of this, I think, is really ties into our climate action summit this week, which is actually thinking about not just those two communities, but also the broad community of civil society. That means NGOs, the multilateral development banks, the private sector. How can those groups partner with the research community, the IPCC, and the national governments to better inform these decisions, to develop the tools that we need for all three of those tasks, and per Dr. Kress's point, to get that information out to a broader public, which can then start to move the politics in the different countries toward greater ambition over time. So time is short. We have 30 months to get ready for the next round, and I think this is a very important moment where we can start thinking about how we can work together, nobody owning this process, but we all working together toward the shared mission of pushing forward on these three tasks. Thank you.
Thank you. We heard yesterday from Vice President Gore about the tremendous breakthroughs in the cost effectiveness of wind and solar technologies, and that amazing graph on the Chilean deployment of solar. Clearly we have success stories, particularly in the renewable electricity sector. I'm wondering who wants to talk about some of the other major opportunities for breakthroughs, either in R&D and innovation or for breaking down barriers to deployment, because obviously we have to address not just electricity, but transportation, land use, forests, agricultures, industrial sectors, the whole world, if we're going to decarbonize the economy. What are some other areas that we ought to be thinking about for possible breakthroughs in collaborative innovation and policy making over the next few years? Anyone want to start on that? Dr. Lee?
Not particularly about the breakthrough, but I must look at what can be the real challenge that are awaiting us. The actions has to be incremental and bottom up. That's what Paris Agreement clearly indicates. But the sum of actions has to be transformational. And that transformational outcome will have to come very fast. How fast? IPCC last report indicates that within 20 years, global electricity production will have to come from 100% renewables. And within 20 years, the world's primary energy resources will have to rely on 60% renewables. Now, it is transformational, and that has to be obtained very, very fast. Now, that leads me to think very seriously about we need to have a clear understanding of the link between the decisions we make today and the consequences that those decisions will entail. And that leads us to think about the incentive structure, which in the end will align the national interest with the pursuing the global public interest. We hope that the IPCC is helping in this process as a facilitative facilitative process. And particularly very glad to recognize our co-chair of Working Group 3, also present in this meeting, and also our past chair of IPCC, Bob Watson, is also in this conference. So we need to have a proper incentive structure so that the world can act properly, so that the individual actions will lead to a transformational outcome in a very, very short period of time.
Sir David, some thoughts on this?
Well, I'm just going to say, I've been working from within the British government for 16 years on this problem. We were the first country to establish carbon budgets going ahead into the future. Absolutely critical is the carbon budget concept. Every 4 years, we've got carbon budgets, and the budget for 2032 is about to be announced, which will take us to a 56% reduction in emissions compared with 1990. Now, what that means is the government departments have to work with every lever in their hands to deliver that objective. Now, I also want to say, and it's been extremely successful. We've already met every budget, but we've also got the new sector, which is our fastest growing sector of all, the clean energy sector. The clean energy sector is now employing 465,000 people in the British Isles. Its turnover is £120 billion, and this fastly growing sector is pulling our economy up in a very difficult situation. So I think where people say, well, what's it going to cost you? The British experience is just the reverse, that our investment through feed-in tariffs has got a tremendous return. Now, let me just answer your question more directly. Not only new technologies in all of those spheres that you mentioned are required, but since we need to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, we also have to look at carbon sinks. So Britain, Germany, and Norway have together created a fund to manage to work with forested countries on a project which says the following: no more deforestation of natural forests, and we will have reforested an area the size of India by 2030. Now, when we've achieved that, and we will achieve it, we will have created a carbon sink equivalent to the CO2 emissions from the United States today. So that, I'm not suggesting the US should continue to emit, but I'm suggesting, of course, that should be shared around the world. Now, we've got 36 forested nations signed up on that program. So I think the answer to your question is we've got to pull every lever, and every lever is an opportunity.
Thank you. Dr. Zhang?
So, so as you know, as you highlighted the importance of the renewables and non-fossils in the global low-carbon energy economy transformation. So you may also know, so China is also the leading nation in terms of the installation of wind turbines and solar PVs. We also have the largest capacity of manufacturing the solar PV and the wind. I think you maybe also know, so China, we also meet a very, challenge. So we have a significant wind curtailment over the past 5 years. So, and for some regions, so the wind curtailment is as high as 60%. So that means it's really a waste of the resources. And so where it could be happened, so I think it's very important. We need the institutional, there is an institution, so the current institutional arrangement makes the failure of even some renewable energy, encouraging renewable energy policies such as feed-in tariffs. So, and in this context, I think in the context of China, we really need some breakthrough or President Xi's word, institutional revolution, to have to create some flexible mechanism, so such that make the policy be incentive compatible. So this.
Thank you. Dr. Kress, Dr. Hultman, we have 1 minute left. If you have some quick thoughts to this question, sorry to squeeze us so tightly, but.
I have very long things to say, but I'll say it shortly. Many people look at museums as institutions that are telling us about the past, but that's not true at all. And what I've tried to emphasize is that museums also look to the future. And I think that's one of the innovations we can think about is the Smithsonian has an alliance of 200 museums around the country, and we are now attempting to use that alliance to tell the story of climate change and environmental change, and encourage museums to look towards the future and what we can do and the solutions for these big issues, not evade them, but actually look to them as the message that the public really wants. And if we could deliver that, I think that will be a big impact on how we make all this happen.
Great. Dr. Alden?
So if we do our jobs right, and the countries around the world adhere to their targets and implement what they said they would, and then they actually put forward a more ambitious set of targets beyond that, Sir David King mentioned this very interesting effect, which is that energy technology prices get driven down even further. And I think that we know that that's going to happen. I think as we're thinking about the mid-century strategies and the deep decarbonization pathways that we'll be on, what we as a research community, as a community of civil society and other actors can do is to communicate that story, to basically say, look, yes, we need more ambition, but as we go down the road, the ambition will actually become in some ways easier. It's always going to be hard, but the next step will be easier still and easier still. So we have to bring that story into the public discussion. I think that one of the kind of outcomes of thinking through the implementation side is what we can do to make that story more visible, because I think it's been pretty invisible up to now. But thank you.
Thank you all. And before I thank the panel, let me ask you to remain seated for one more keynote address by Dr. David Rivingen before we break for lunch. But please join me in thanking this excellent panel for just a short dive into this topic.